It's so great to be here. Thank you so much for a very warm welcome. I hear just this morning was incredible. I had the joy of being with Scripture Union, some folks down there at Wallace High School and some training. I've just come in and heard just incredible reports of what's going on. It's always difficult to follow after somebody like Malcolm. But it is great to be here and to think about faith and culture and how we awaken our sense of engagement with it. So I suppose some of the things that were in the emails we were corresponding about it, free speech and some of the news headlines and the Asher's case and the Equality Commission, and how do we relate well to culture? What does that look like for us as Christians? How do we react to these stories? Do we go on the defensive? Do we go on the attack? Do we speak? Do we remain silent? Where does the gospel stand in some of these issues? And for me, I think our role as Christians is to change culture. Now, at moments, that means we confront the lies of our culture and we call them out for what they are. At other times, we subvert that by offering a different story that cuts across the dominant narrative, as I would call it, the sort of cycle that we hear in the news. And finally, we get to recreate the horizons of possibility and impossibility by inhabiting this different story, this God story that we have. And so I want to look a little bit at that today. I'm really struck by the story of the emperor's new clothes. Oh, how fine are the new clothes, people said. And nobody wanted to confess that he hadn't got anything on. And that little boy was saying, but he's got no clothes on. And people were kind of hushing the little boy. And then one person whispered to another what the child had said. And slowly people began to mutter and to murmur, but he hasn't got anything on. And the emperor knew it was too late then. And he had to continue in this procession with people holding up a train that was not there. And Hans Christian Andersen's story seems to me like a prophetic tale about our culture. It hasn't got any clothes on, but nobody wants to point that out. Nobody wants to say the story that we're being fed by our culture is empty. It's void. It's meaningless. See, our culture is a really effective disciple-making machine. The average child in the US watches 16,000 adverts every single year. In the UK, we spend almost half of our waking hours watching TVs, using mobiles, or on the web. In fact, the average person spends just under 4 hours a day watching TV. That's 9 years of their whole lives. We've got to the point where I think, I've forgotten the exact figures, but we spend something like 8 hours a day on mobile communication devices, on the web and on computers. We spend 9 hours on that, but in an 8-hour period because we spend so much time multitasking. We're on Twitter and we're watching the TV, we're on Facebook and we're watching a video and a DVD, and we consume so much material comes in, and our society is constantly transmitting a set of values to us. It's discipling us. It's shaping us. Don't create, just consume. You veg out in front of the TV, you surf the web. These are very kind of reactive poses that we have. And so this stuff just comes at us. We crash out in front of the telly. And so we sort of disengage our brains. We let our guards down. And the culture begins to shape us. Don't commit. Cohabit. Try before you buy. Keep your options open. Why wait and save when you can buy now and pay later? Why work? Just go and play the lottery. Get yourself on a reality TV show. And we're so immersed in our culture, sometimes we fail to realize just how powerful it is at shaping us and the messages that it sends us. But it tells us a story, and I think it's one that many people fall for, and nobody wants to point out the emperor's new clothes, that there's this story that's just so void. Paul says this in Romans 12, 1 and 2, reading from the Message. So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God and you'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what he wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, which is always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God wants the best in you, develops well-formed maturity in you. Our culture is shaping us, and Paul warns us not to become so well adjusted to it that we don't even know how to respond. Don't get dragged down to its level of immaturity. God wants the best in us. When I went off to university, I bumped into, I've got to do something first. There we go. I bumped into a story. I'm very graphic and visual, so it's a very complicated image I put up here for you, of an arrow. I bumped into a story that I was being told. It's the story of how the world worked when I went off to university. It's the story I bump into in the media every single day. There's a particular story they're trying to tell about the way the world works. And I wasn't sure where my faith fitted in with this story. Did my faith run at a slight angle to it? Did it maybe run in the opposite direction to it? But it seemed to me my Christianity and this other story didn't overlap. And I was faced with abandoning my faith or compartmentalizing, becoming schizophrenic in the process, having my faith over here and this other new stuff that I was learning separately. And with the help of others, friends, real life friends and people I was reading, C.S. Lewis and others, I began to see things a little bit differently, that the story that I was being fed actually raises more questions than it answers. It starts with a series of questions. Where did we come from? And you begin to ask that question of our culture. So it's not really clear where we come from. We're just a random collection of cells. We've evolved from, we're no different than the animals. We have no purpose. We're not designed for any kind of relationship. Nobody's really that sure. It just raises a series of questions. Where are we heading to? What's the story of the world that we get fed every day in our media and in our newspapers? It's not really very clear. Oh, we have a slight graphic issue there, but I put them up as isms. There's a series of isms, but that's just a posh way of saying some things. Humanism is just that we can solve our own problems. So you meet people who say, well, if we as human beings just worked a bit harder, we could solve the world problems. You know, if we just got on a little bit better. I met a guy last night, we were holding a hustings. A politician, he said, well, I was showing him around the church building. He said, I'm not very religious, but I'm spiritual. I said, what does that mean? Well, you know, if we just worked harder for equality and justice, I think, Northern Ireland could be a better place. Really? That's it? We can solve our own problems just by being a bit nicer to each other? And people look at me like I'm weird sometimes for what I believe. I was thinking, that's just ludicrous. But that is the story, that we as human beings can just solve this thing if we try a bit harder. That's humanism. Capitalism. Now, if you go out to somebody on the street and say, what's your worldview? They'll just look at you, funny. But they certainly won't say, I'm a capitalist. But you say to people, what drives you? What motivates you? People say, well, I'm going off to college to get a good job so I can earn some money. So I can buy a nicer house, buy a better car, go on more holidays, have a better life. I buy stuff. Individualism, consumerism, and materialism. So many people are driven by that. It's all about me and what I can do with the money that I earn. There's not a lot else that really drives their life. So it's all about the clothes that you wear, the labels that you have, the amount of money that you earn, the job that you have, whether you've got a pay rise, whether you've got a promotion, whether you've got a nice car parked in the drive. There's not a lot else that drives their lives. Agnosticism and apathy, well, that's just a nice way of saying I don't know and I don't care about the future. You ask, well, where's the world heading to? What's the big story? Well, I don't know. I don't want to think about that. That makes my head hurt. And so people just I don't know where it's going. We can't tell. And finally, I suppose some people, atheists or nihilism in the more extreme. The atheists at least have the integrity to say, look, I believe there is no God. I can't prove it. And you ask Mr. Dawkins where the world's heading to, and he says he doesn't know. You ask a why question of Richard Dawkins, he says, that's a silly question. Why are we here? That's a silly question. Really, Richard? Maybe that's a silly answer. We need to start challenging some of these stories. So as I began to ask these questions, I thought, do you know what? There aren't great answers out there. Richard Dawkins in this movie, The Unbelievers, is debating the Catholic Archbishop, and the Catholic Archbishop says, why do we exist? And that's when Richard laughs and says, oh, why is a silly question? Science can't answer why questions, therefore they're silly. That just seems to me incredible. If you ever want to be motivated to get out there and tell people about Jesus, watch the movie Unbelievers. Watch Richard Dawkins and his mates. And it is so hopeless. They offer nothing as a story of the world. So we're heading towards these range of isms. And there's hundreds of different isms out there, or ways in which people think we're going in the future. And the God story doesn't run at a slight angle to that, at a slight tangent. Doesn't run in the opposite direction. As best I understand it, it absolutely smashes across it. It jars with it. It upsets it. It cuts across it. And it starts in this radically different place with the Creator God, and it heads in a radically different direction to Revelation 21. And because we start with a creator, some of the key questions that we and our culture wants to ask are answered really differently. When I do panels and people ask questions, they often come down into what I say 3 categories. First is identity. Because we are made in the image of a creator God, then everybody's identity is a divine image bearer. Everybody. Every single person, from that wonderful, cute child or nephew that you have to that really annoying neighbor or boss that you have, is a divine image bearer. Everyone is made in the image of God. That's the way we're all created. Secondly, we're all designed for relationship. And so many questions that people have around relationships in various forms. A relationship with God, a relationship with each other, and the relationship with the world that he created. We're wired for relationship. We are made in the image of a relational God who is at his very center 3 in 1. We're divine image bearers. And we have a purpose. He designed us, made us, created us to steward and to create and to cultivate within the creation in which he has set us. So the third type of question people ask is always around purpose. Identity, relationships, purpose. So many of the issues that people have are around those 3 questions. So the Bible frames those entirely differently in our culture, and we need to be happy to say that. Not only does it frame them differently, it actually answers them in a way I think our culture can't. And this is, where are we heading? Well, we're heading to Revelation 21, where God will make his dwelling place with humanity in a new heavens and a new earth. The biblical story is incredibly coherent. It's an incredible story of the world. Leslie Newbegin, the great missiologist who was a bishop in India, said this: the way we understand human life depends on what conception we have of the human story. What's the story of which our lives are a part? Everybody's life forms part of a story. And I think we as Christians have too often allowed our faith to be privatized. This is my story. I get up on a good day, I'm doing my quiet time, I relate to God, it's all about me and him, and that's it. And there's no public aspect to it. We've vacated the public square. And what's striking to me about this image is that it forms a cross, and at the heart of that we see Jesus. You see, Jesus upset the story of his day, so much so that the Romans had him crucified. Jesus upset the story of his day, so much so that the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the religious leaders took him to Pilate to have him crucified. And they cried out, crucify him, because he upset the story of the day. The way he lived was at odds with the culture of the day. And so the cross reminds us that it's hard. It reminds us that we find Jesus at the intersection, at the heart of what I like to think of as the public square, our culture. Tom Wright says this, the theologian and writer: the whole point of Christianity is that it offers a story which is the story of the whole world. It's public truth. If it's true for us, it's true for everyone. There is no option to have a little privatized faith that says, it's all right, it's just between me and God and it doesn't really affect you. If it's true at all, then it's true for everybody. So it's public truth, and that's why we need to engage in the public square, in culture. Now, the public square is a funny term that might appeal to somebody like me, but the public square can be Twitter and it can be Facebook. The public square can be the checkout counter. The public square can be our workplace. It can be over our neighbor's fence or over the wall. It can be in our community center. We're all engaging in our culture, in relationships every day. We're relational beings. We meet people, we encounter them, we engage with them every day. If you think through your average day, imagine how many encounters you have with people. Imagine how many people you meet. I sometimes say I hardly meet any non-Christians because I work in all these Christian spheres. And then I remember I go through airport security, and there's this really interesting moment, because I travel quite a bit, where I stand like this in a cruciform image in that moment, and I'm rather bitter often, and I have to try and learn how to smile and bless somebody and say, I really appreciate the job you're doing in security at this moment, as you wave a magic wand all around me. But I have these moments with people where they have no choice but to speak to me, and I can say all sorts of things that are good and helpful and blessing in their day. And imagine how many people upset your day. It can be the simplest thing. It can be the really annoying person at a checkout, or somebody cuts you up on the road who really kind of throws your day. And so we have all these relational encounters every day. I've got sidetracked. I'm not sure why I'm there. Because we're meeting people, and so it's all about how we live in the God story in that moment. That's how we impact culture. It doesn't have to be high level. It's all sorts of ways in which we bump into people. So how do I break this story down a little bit sometimes? Here's an example I sometimes use is human trafficking. So everybody thinks human trafficking is wrong. Good. I ask people, why is it wrong? And they say, well, it's just obviously wrong. So yeah, you probably wouldn't let me away with that as a Christian. You'd want me to explain the next line. Why is it a bad idea? So you see, for me, everybody is created as a divine image bearer. So an act of abuse against another human being is an act of high treason against God. Everyone's a divine image bearer. Everybody's made for a relationship. Male, female, exclusive relationship. Everybody's made with a purpose to steward and to cultivate and to create. Human trafficking breaches each bit of that: identity, relationship, and purpose. So it's got a problem for me on the God story. When I go to people who aren't Christians and I say, if we're just a random collection of cells, if we have evolved from and are no different than animals, if we're heading towards capitalism, well, we can buy and sell people's labor and we can buy and sell sex on our streets. Why can't I traffic somebody else on your story? What in your framework tells me that it's wrong? Where does your sense of morality come from? The story of the world has a real problem. I was debating with Mr. Nolan's crew one day on child euthanasia, and it's being moves to make it legal in Belgium. This is the notion that you can, an 8-year-old can terminate their own life because of an illness that they have. And so I said, well, out of interest, guys, why me? Why is somebody else not doing this piece opposing it? I said, there's lots of other people who oppose child euthanasia, but they're pro-abortion or they're pro-euthanasia. And they know that logically there's no reason at this moment just suddenly to say, well, because it's an 8-year-old, I'm against it. They've already given up the argument around abortion or euthanasia, that some lives can be ended. And they don't want to get caught out live on air doing this interview. You see, they've no moral framework left. They know that fundamentally in their gut, 8-year-old euthanasia, this is wrong. But they've conceded ground at either end of the spectrum because they don't have a framework anymore as to what's right and what's wrong. And so when we engage culturally, we have a really good story that upsets the world. It does. We don't go out of our way to upset them, but it does, because it starts in a different place. And it's upsetting sometimes that we say every single person's a divine image bearer. And that's challenging with human trafficking, because it doesn't mean just that the victims are divine image bearers. It means the abusers are divine image bearers. It means the traffickers are divine image bearers. We have to wrestle with what that means. So we're engaging in culture, and I put up 4 terms there. So I see this as Jesus is right at the heart of the public square. He just sat right within that narrative. And there are 4 terms that we use a lot in our work within engaging in culture. And there are 4 terms that are really common in our culture that I think it might be helpful to look at for a few minutes and think about. So justice, equality, freedom, and truth. These are words that are common and familiar to us as Christians, but they're also words used a lot in our society and our culture. And it's really interesting to push around them sometimes, because justice is really hard to define. And we often think of it as meaning punishment. People say, I want justice. What they really mean is, I want somebody punished. I want somebody taken to court. I want somebody put in prison. And that's one aspect of justice. In the Old Testament, that's mishpat. That's the punishment aspect. But there's another word, tzedekah, which means right relationships. And so in the Bible, justice is very strongly framed about having right relationships. And the more right relationships you have, the less need there is for punishment. The more of that proactive, right relational justice you have, the less need there is for the reactive punishment. But our society is obsessed with reactive justice, punishment justice. And the more we frame relationships better, then the less need there is for that. So when we enter areas like welfare reform and human trafficking, we're saying, yes, it's about justice. It's about establishing right relationships. The problem with human trafficking is it is a breach of that right relational setup. The problem with some of the welfare reforms is, how do you establish right relationship? How do you respect the need for people to work and to treat people as household units rather than necessarily individuals? But how do you provide the safety net? And so we engage. And there's this wonderful tension in the text between acting justly, and loving mercy. Seeking justice but offering forgiveness. To be people of compassion in this moment. And so there's a real challenge for us as Christians. How do we engage in a culture and say, yes, we're totally for justice. The Bible's really clear. But also mercy and forgiveness and compassion. How do we engage in those conversations? How do we bring that language? Because mercy and grace and compassion are not common language within our culture. That's one of the ways in which Jesus upset the culture of his day. What about equality? You see, equality is in danger of becoming the idol of our age. It considers people en masse, I think. It categorizes them, it boxes them up, it compares them. It doesn't actually treat people well as individuals or as divine image bearers. Biblical equality is much more radical. It's a given. Everyone is a divine image bearer. Everyone is already declared to be equal in the biblical text. Everyone reflects something of God. But there's also diversity in that. We reflect God in different ways. And so equality comes up all the time in discussions around same-sex marriage. I was on the radio one day and one of the guys said, again, came back to the argument about equality. And I said, I don't believe in equality, just to see what he'd do. So that flummoxed him. I said, well, define equality. Well, equality is actually quite hard to define. So John was struggling with a definition. So I said, I expanded a little. I said, I do believe in equality, but I have a very different understanding than what you mean. He won't use the word equality anymore with me, because I just said, well, we'll stop, because what do you mean, equality of outcome, equality of opportunity? What do you mean by equality? You just announce that like that's the thing, done, discussion over, I have played the equality card. Let's unpack that. I love equality in the sense that everybody's made in the image of God. But that challenges our rules around sexism and the role of women, around how we engage with those who are disabled, on discussions on race and immigrants within our community. There's some really interesting discussions, but also how do we celebrate diversity within that? We are different. So how do we do that well? How do we say, I'm not doing this on the grounds of equality, I'm doing this because I want to be generous and hospitable. We're welcoming the other in because we want to be generous like God is. We want to have these moments of hospitality and generosity. And so we want to challenge some of the agenda around equality. This might happen. Okay, equality and justice we've just talked about. Do you see the difference in the two? 3 boxes on the left-hand side, everybody's equal. Only 2 of them can see the game. It's clearly from America. It's a baseball game. I apologize. So the little guy on the right still can't see. Then you see the difference in justice or equity or fairness on the right. So we don't all start in the same place. We're all made different. So there are times when I don't want to see equality. Equality is going to lead to a bad outcome. Whereas if we distribute things correctly, justice and fairness leads to a much better outcome. So there are moments where we say, no, equality is not good. If we want equality of outcome, we're going to have to do some things differently. And so we need to challenge that narrative as if equality is it. We do want to embrace equality. I want to say equality is a strong and good thing in my engagement in the public square, but I don't want to just say, oh yeah, that's it, you've played that card, I'm done. Justice and equity are really interesting ideas too. I think they're actually stronger. Human dignity is the start of this conversation. Everybody's an image bearer, from which I think we have a sense of justice, right relationships. Only then do we get down to issues like equality and diversity. They sit underneath that. Rights, responsibilities, equality, dignity come because we're divine image bearers, because we have a sense of justice. And that hierarchy is important because equality has risen to the top, and that's a problem. You can't separate it out on its own. Freedom, just going back to our grid, is another really great word. We absolutely believe in freedom. It was for freedom that Christ has set us free. That's a really core Christian idea. We love it. But freedom has become confused with meedom in our society. It's all about me. Freedom means I get to do what I want. Meedom, which is a word I've made up just in case you're wondering, is not the same as freedom. But our society is obsessed with individualism and choice. It's my choice, my body, my choice, to use one of the slogans. I get to do what I want. A lot of talk about rights. None of responsibilities. You can't have a right unless somebody gives you. The right to education, the right to housing requires somebody else to provide that for you. So we're much more relational. It goes back to that justice relational idea when we talk about rights and responsibilities. So God has given us incredible freedom, but that freedom is about us choosing to love God who first loved us, to submit and to limit our freedom on behalf of the other. We want our freedoms largely so that we can benefit, be generous, be hospitable, extend grace and mercy and forgiveness to the other. I want to be free to be able to do that. Freedom's becoming confused. Some of you may have seen Louis Theroux, who's a journalist, commentator, TV personality. He's got this program, and he was doing one on transgender kids as young as 6, I think, was the youngest. That was a born male and was then saying she was female at the age of 6. And it was all around respecting the choice of these kids. Well, where do we draw the lines in that? Where do we move from, that's a good idea there, freedom and medium and our understanding of choice? The same-sex marriage and sexuality conversation has been the one to date. Sexuality is arguably not locked and as obvious, so there seems to be a little bit more, I don't want to get too far down a conversation here around choice, but so gender would seem to be really clear. There's male and there's female. There's a very small number of people who genetically are hermaphrodites. Now we have a whole other conversation going on. These are people who are very clearly biologically male and saying, I want to self-describe as female. So Facebook has 50 different categories or statuses around gender. So if you think the sexuality discussion has been difficult, gender is just a whole other level. But this is real choice stuff coming in. People saying, well, it's my choice to self-identify. And we're going to have to engage, challenge, stand up, because the final category is truth. In the 4 things, the 4 pillars, I would call them, of the public square. That's tough sometimes, because we have to just say, well, actually, do you know what the truth is? Well, hold on, sorry. Modernism, there's 2 kind of main schools of thought out there. I'm still deeply traumatized because earlier this week I turned 40, and I haven't psychologically accepted this yet. But I am a child of modernity, I would say. I'm also trained as a lawyer, so I like to see the evidence, and based on the evidence, I will tell you what I think the answer is. So truth is discovered by reason. I want to reason and argue and see evidence for things and test things and weigh them up, and that's what the modernists did. So that's what all the people above 40 in this room are supposed to have been trained in and schooled in, and that's the way our minds work. Everybody younger than that's a postmodernist, so they just believe in story. I say just, that's already made a slightly judgmental comment on postmodernity. There's no such thing as truth anymore in postmodernity. It's just my truth and your truth, and you tell your story, and that's great, that's wonderful, that's your story. And I tell my story over here, and that's great, that's my story. Well, it doesn't matter who you're engaging with. There's incredible amounts of evidence that I want to engage with those who believe in modernity with and say, what are you going to do with Jesus? There's a real guy called Jesus who lived and died and rose again. Lewis is brilliant on this. I'm trying to prevent anyone saying that really foolish thing that people so often say, that Jesus was just a great moral teacher. He'd either be a lunatic on the level of a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. This man was and is the Son of God, or a madman, or something worse. And the evidence is there around Jesus as a historical figure. But if you're a postmodernist, then everybody says, hey, everybody has their story, and that's great. So then I just go around telling all my postmodern friends, well, here's my God story. This is what God's doing in my life. And the thing is, they can't challenge that. They can't say it's wrong, because postmodernity doesn't allow you to say that. Everything's true, everything goes, and so we just tell our stories. Wonderful. And the thing is, there's some bits of our stories that are going to jar with them, because if somebody gets healed, if somebody comes to faith like this morning, if somebody gets radically turned around from a life of addiction or a life of crime or whatever it is, well, that upsets people. They don't know what to do with that. And eventually our God stories begin to jar with the story of this world, because it has no power. It has no answers. And so it's really important that we live into our stories and begin to challenge and tell the truth and say, hey, do you know what? 1.3% of the population is gay. That's an Office of National Statistics survey of or just shy of 500,000 people. And you hear every single politician, it's 5, 7, 10, 8%. It's not. It's 1.3%. So let's have a serious conversation based on the facts if we're going to do that. But here's have another conversation. The church has not dealt well with that. That's also the truth. 80% of people, of male respondents to a survey, Christians in Northern Ireland, thought pornography, 81% thought it was harmful. Young Christian men, 80% that accessed it. 81% think it's harmful, 80% that accessed it. Well, we've got a problem there. That's that schizophrenia stuff, and one of others is going to win out there. We know we've got problems with issues like that within our churches. Relational breakdown in the UK costs £46 billion a year. That's £1,300 per taxpayer. That's a massive cost. Nobody wants to talk about that. If we start playing with relationships, changing them up, it's going to cost all of us in society. The state has only ever been interested in marriage because it's a cheap way to raise kids. Once you start changing that, then the state shouldn't be involved in it anymore. That's the only reason it ever got involved in marriage. It's the only reason it ever embraced it. That's just the reality. So we have to have conversations where we know some facts and we talk about those and say, here's the truth about some of these matters. But again, in jarring with that or in upsetting that, we talk about truth, but then we talk about the faith that we have taking a step of faith. I don't think it needs to be a leap, but it is still a step. We talk about grace because grace and truth come through Christ. We have a world that's now driving after truth at times, and truth is a really cold, hard concept on its own. We bring grace to that conversation. It looks really different. And we need to put the two together and offer hope. To live without hope is to cease to live, Dostoevsky said. Hope is what drives out fear, and so our story is one of hope. It is one of justice, equality, truth, and freedom, but it is also one of grace and mercy and forgiveness and hope. So we need to respond and engage with our culture. And sometimes when you say the word culture, people think, well, who are the big culture makers or shakers? Well, it's Tim Berners-Lee and the World Wide Web, or it's Nelson Mandela, or it's William Wilberforce, and these are the big folks who've shaped culture. But going back to my airport security moment, who most affects your everyday life? Your wife, your kids, your boss, your next door neighbor, your colleagues? Who's had an impact on you today? The person who served you at lunchtime, the person you're going to speak to just after this, me. When you go home, who you're going to talk to about it? Who's going to have an impact on your life on Monday morning? Your university colleagues, your work colleagues, teachers? Who really shapes the culture of your life? See, I get to, in my job, meet certain people. I might get to go and see the education minister about something. But my wife is on the board of governors of the school, and she has a lot more impact on our school. And the teacher, Mrs. Barr, my kid's teacher, has a lot more impact on my child than I do in a meeting with the education minister. I'm not saying mine's irrelevant, but the reality is the person who shapes the culture in a school, board of governors and PTA and headmaster and the actual teachers, shape the culture of those environments. They will have much more daily impact on my child. And so all of us get to shape culture in all sorts of ways because we have all sorts of relationships. We change the culture and the environments that we're in. That's our job. There isn't just this one big culture, this one big public square. We are all engaging with people all the time. A guy called Andy Crouch is really helpful in how we think about engaging. So he talks about the difference between a gesture and a posture. So he says a posture is what we do all the time, and if our posture is a particular way, it's a problem. So if our posture is to condemn, a lot of Christians condemn culture. We say, oh, this is bad, and this movie's really bad, and therefore we shouldn't go to the cinema ever again. And then we kind of think, oh, well, no, the next stage is to critique. So we say, well, I only go to the movies so I can critique them and say, oh, well, there was a lovely story there, but then they ruined it with this bit. And what we do is we become better critics than artists. We don't actually create anything, we just critique everybody else's. And then we maybe copy it and say, well, why should the devil have all the good music? We'll just make our own version of Christian rock and Christian hip-hop and Christian whatever. And it's usually not as good as the original. Or we consume it, which is ultimately what most of us do. We actually just go to the cinema, we read the same newspapers as everybody else, and it makes no difference. We just walk out of the same movie, we finish reading the same book, we finish reading the same news article, we play on the same sports team, and you wouldn't know any difference. We've just consumed it in the same way as the person right beside us. And consumers live unthinkingly within culture's pre-existing horizons of possibility and impossibility. Consumers just take something off the peg. There's the range, there's 3 sizes, that's all you can have. There's the horizons of possibility and impossibility. You have to operate within that sort of framework. And that's the problem with consumption. It's really narrow. And so somebody else does the thinking and provides it to us, and we just consume it. And I think Andy Crouch is right to say those are fine as gestures from time to time. We do need to critique something and say, well, no, I've got a problem with that and the way that was done. We need to condemn it and say, that's just bad. There are times we want to copy something and say, whoa, that was a really great idea. Could we do something with that? Change it a little bit? Can we just consume stuff? There's some really good food out there. There's some really good clothes. There's some stuff we just consume, and that's good. But if that becomes our permanent posture, all we do is consume. All we do is critique. We've got a problem. And the reason we've got a problem is because when it comes to culture, our role is to change culture. Our role is to engage with it by cultivating and creating. 2 things, cultivating and creating. And to cultivate, Genesis tells us that's to care for what's already there, to weed out some of those little problems around it. So we just, and 90% of our time is spent cultivating what's already there. The surgeon who performs a new technique has first performed 1,000 routine operations before he does this new procedure. We spend most of our time cultivating. I teach my daughter to draw. I don't really teach her to read and write. I read and write with her. Her teacher teaches her some of these things. And that's cultivating those skills so that eventually she will create something new. But there's a lot of cultivation first. We cultivate language within them and skills. My child was banned from saying the word we, so then I had to ban my office from saying the word we, because if I wasn't allowed to say it at home, then I couldn't say it in my office. And I'm not allowed to say the word like. So I said, oh, Karen, I really like that. She said, no, Daddy, you can't say like. I said, no, you're not allowed to say it at the end of a sentence and in between every other sentence. But I can say it. No, Daddy, you can't say the word like. Okay, I really appreciate your drawing. So, but we're cultivating, we're weeding out some of the little tendencies that are in there, but caring for what is already beautiful. And most of our time is spent cultivating. And then every now and again, we get to create something new. We get to create a new book, a new piece of work, a new essay. Create a new child, a new family unit. We create a new procedure in work. We create a new sports team because we put the team together in a different way. We create a new way of doing something, a new piece of art, a new piece of sculpture. And the reality is, within our society, our role is to do this cultivation and creation. And when it comes to changing culture, what we try to do, I sometimes use an illustration, culture is like a glass of water. And then into it's got poured various things like hot sauce that speaks of anger, and mustard that speaks of selfishness. Because if somebody cooks you a really nice meal and you put mustard all over it, what you're saying is, I don't like what you've created, your taste. I'm going back to mustard because I like it. And you put in coffee that speaks of, I think it's gossip, and you just put all these things, lemon that speaks of the bitterness, vinegar that speaks of pride. It looks all right from a distance, but you get up close and it stinks. You just put all these into a glass of water and thinking, what do you do? And sometimes we are to sift things out, to try and pick them out. But actually how we really recreate culture is to take a huge jug of new water of the Spirit and just begin to pour it into that cup. And as you pour and pour and pour more and more water, the other stuff gets displaced out to the side. And slowly but surely all the gunk and the dirt and the filth begins to move out. Because we just keep pouring in new cultures. We create new stuff. Crouch tells the story of his kids. They have a chili night every Thursday night in their house. And he really loves chili and his kids don't like chili. So that's a problem. And he said, well, they can condemn it, and they can and say, I don't like it, but that's not going to get them very far because he's the dad and he's in charge. They can critique it and they could say, well, I'd like less onions and less tomatoes, and that probably won't work either, he said. Ideally, they'll just consume it. But he said the only way that's going to change, if he comes home some Thursday night, instead of him starting to prepare chili, he finds that they've made an incredible Thai green curry. They've created something else in its place. And he goes, well, that's awesome. I don't need to make mine. So the way you displace culture is to create something new. And so some of what we have to do, yes, we critique from time to time and we condemn and we stand up, but we also need to create a new way of doing stuff. We bring life by telling new stories and new ways of engaging with culture. When we create new family meal times, when you create a date night with your wife, when we do timekeeping well, when we honor the other in the way that we talk about them, when we say, well, I can't change the whole school, but in my classroom it's going to be like this. In my office I'm going to turn the photographs out instead of in. I have photos of my kids and they used to sit in to me, and that's great, and I remember that I have kids. But when I turn them around and tell everybody else I have kids as well, I am a whole person. I am part of this family unit. It's funny the way we orientate our desks often into us. There can just be small things and small ways in which we change the culture. And we say, well, within my space, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to play some worship music in the background in my environment. A teacher in school, she was a sub-teacher, and the other teacher came and said, hey, your kids are really well behaved. You've only been in a couple of days, and this class was carnage beforehand. How do you do that? So I'm just playing this kind of worship music quietly in the background, and that was just what was making the difference. She didn't check with anybody, and she just said that's what was helping keep her class calm. This guy in America complaining about school prayer, and there's a whole discussion about whether it should be banned, and he said, I pray with my kids every day. And said, how do you do that? I said, well, I'm teaching a special needs class, and I just lift the kids up and I walk around with them quite often. It's a much more intimate environment. He just said, I'm praying over them. They don't know it. Well, they might, but they're not hearing it audibly. But he said, I know that's stilling that class. I am praying with them. I don't need to get worried about, because it's America, the amendments there and the Constitution. Nobody can stop me praying for my kids and my work colleagues. They might be able to stop you going over and audibly putting your hand on them and doing it. But they can't stop you praying for them. It can't stop you creating a different culture within your environment, one that's always going to honor, one that's going to speak well of your spouse and speak well of your family. We're not going to say, the wife, oh, my kids are such a burden, they're such a chore. You're going to say, no, I'm going to speak well of this. Why is when somebody gets married, oh, that's the end of your life, oh, no more nights out. And we kind of joke, but man, we've got to speak healthily about marriages. They're under enough pressure without us going, oh, that's the end of your life, ball and chain, stuck to, all this kind of silly language we have. That's how we shift culture actually quite significantly. Few of us are going to change the world. That's just the reality, but we can bring about a lot of significant local change. We can change the horizons of possibility and impossibility for people locally. Northern Ireland is a interesting culture, as you all know, and probably more than many others, we have those horizons of possibility and impossibility. We say, you can do this, you can't do that. There are ways in which you can do it. There are traditional routes in which you can march. There are ways in which you do things on a church. There are committees in which you have to go through. In all of our culture, we're a very civil service oriented culture. We create very fixed horizons of what's acceptable and possible. And if we begin to enlarge those and allow people to create and change culture, that can be incredibly powerful. Our job is not to change the world, but to cultivate and to create. And in doing so, we may change the world for the one or two around us. But that can be hugely significant. We cultivate, we care for what is already beautiful whilst weeding out what is harmful. And we create by putting something new in the world, by pouring out God's love and God's Spirit in new ways. I'm going to finish with this, and then if anybody has any questions. I love this little sort of analogy. This is a US Navy radio communique. Voice 1, please divert your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. Voice 2, recommend you divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid a collision. Voice 1, this is the captain of a US Navy ship. I say again, divert your course. Voice 2, no, I say again, divert your course. Voice 1, this is the aircraft carrier Enterprise. We are a large warship of the US Navy. Divert your course now. Voice 2, this is a lighthouse. Your call. Sometimes it's easy being a lighthouse because that's it, you're stuck, that's where you are. And sometimes it's really difficult because people shout at you and go, get out of the way, and do you know who I am? And do you realize what you're talking about? Yeah, actually, I'm anchored in the text, the God story that really jars with the culture of this world, and we stand in our lighthouse and we stand as a beacon, but we throw out light. We have to witness, we have to throw it out. It's not a defensive position being a lighthouse. It's a beacon position. We send out this huge array of light. We're trying to light the seas to warn others. But there are moments where we just say, hey, I'm stuck on a rock. Your choice. You might be the USS Enterprise. You might be the big emperor with his new clothes, as I would say, marching towards me. You've got no clothes on. That's all I can tell you. So I want to partly expose the story of our culture. That's the kind of, we confront it, then we subvert it in the way in which we tell our story, but ultimately we recreate the horizons of possibility and impossibility, because the God story is an incredible story. From chaos in Genesis 1 to order, from emptiness, the earth was formless and it was void, through to life. Well, that's fun. Just lost that. From bondage to freedom in the Exodus story. From the desert into the land of abundance. From exile to a place of flourishing. They were taken off into exile, and it says, seek the peace and prosperity of the city. The people who carried you into exile, go and seek their peace and prosperity. From death to life in that moment of the incarnation. From death to life. And so we bring life, and finally from heaven to earth. That's the big story that we get to inhabit and indwell. How do we live it out and bump into culture? So I'm happy to answer questions. I get to do that in different ways with Mr. Nolan and Mr. Crawley and others, but that's not always the most relevant, because all of us shape culture. All of us shape culture. It's really important. Much as I love, and I really would value prayers, for me, everybody's shaping culture all the time. I'm happy to we've got 5 minutes or thereabouts. Does anybody have a question? Otherwise, I'll just talk about all my pet subjects, which is great. to me, the big story of the Bible continues to make those movements, the chaos to order, but especially emptiness to life and desert to abundance. I mean, that's always been the movement of the text, is to release people, to set them free, to bring that creativity into play. We are fundamentally creative beings. I mean, we're made in the image of a creative God who made the whole world, and then he said, I make you as my idols or image bearers. The word is the same. It's only used 10 times in the text, and usually it means an idol. He's saying it's like this incredible language. Everybody's an image bearer. It's really powerful. And then he says all of his creativity he's giving into us to be these creative beings, to create culture. And we create culture in our families, in our homes, in all sorts of environments, releasing, freeing, and setting people out to do stuff. But that has to come out of the power of, I mean, I wasn't here this morning, but from what I gleaned, from what Malcolm was saying, it has to come out of relationship with Christ. And that's what makes a difference for us. That's what just sets everything apart. If you try and go out and jar with culture on your own, no. If we just do it by trying to set a set of rules, by being negative, no. Jesus came to bring life. That's what's going to jar with the culture in a healthy way. I don't go out of my way to be awkward with culture. We do it because we want to tell a story that says, do you know who's setting people free from debt? Christians and Christian Against Poverty. You know who's providing all the food in the food banks? It's largely Christians who are doing it. Do you know who does most of the youth work in Northern Ireland? 69% of it is Christians. Do you know who's providing some of the housing projects that's going on outside of the state? It's going to be Christians. Guess who's setting up the job clubs? Guess who's setting up the mums and tots groups? Guess who's looking after the old people? Guess who's running the old people's homes? Who does all this stuff? As the state gets smaller, there's a huge space for us as Christians, and we're doing it, and people know it. The state is aware of this, but we need to tell some of those stories as well. We always try and tell a good news story. We don't always succeed. So when I'm on with Nolan the odd time, he's talking about same-sex marriage, and I talk about trafficking, and he says, well, stop talking about human trafficking. And I said, no, this is the symptom of the same relational breakdown. Once we get relationships wrong, it's supposed to be a male-female exclusive relationship. If you start playing with that, there are lots of consequences. One is that people choose to enter same-sex relationships. Another is that people choose to go into prostitution, go and to be with a prostitute, or engage in trafficking, or pornography. These are all symptoms of relational breakdown. They're all coming from the same aspect of the text for me. When I speak to young people, sometimes I was doing a seminar at an event, and then I would do one on trafficking, and they'll say, that's great, really agreed with you there. And we go to the next one, it's same-sex marriage, and they'd look and go, it's you. And I said, what are you lot doing? Why do you think that trafficking is bad but you're very fuzzy around same-sex marriage? It is the same biblical parts of the text that has led my understanding about how we form relationships. God said, this is the way you need to do it. Is this tough stuff? Do we need to improve our language? Yes, we do. Do I engage with the LGBT community and others to try and do it? Yes. But nonetheless, there's a frame at play here that we've got to get wise to and say, God said this is the way we're wired for a relationship. Sorry, we're on a rant now. This is great. Go off. But once we get those frames in play, then we're saying that's why it's so important we know the story. We've got to know the story and indwell this biblical story and say, isn't this amazing what God's given us? Look at the way the text moves from the creator God who said, you've got identity, you've got relationship, you've got purpose. You can answer most questions from Genesis 1 to 3 about the whole of life, in my humble opinion. I love Genesis 1 to 3. So much of our framing of who we are, what we're about, and the way we're supposed to relate is set up in there. And then it's just repeated throughout the text, and we see God intervening in the same ways, coming down, freeing us in Exodus, coming down in the spirit of the Messiah, incarnating, literally enfleshing and meeting himself into us. And then Revelation 21, God will make his dwelling place with us again. He's going to redeem and restore all of humanity. All of humanity. Colossians 1, he wants to redeem all things. So we've got to enlarge our vision. It's not just about saving souls. It's not just about getting people out of hell and into heaven. It's not in the biblical text. It's not, I'm a Christian, get me out of here. It's about getting God out of heaven and into humanity. That's what Jesus came to do. So that's very different. It's only maybe a little nuance, you might say, but it's radically different than what we're talking about. It's not about getting us out of hell and into heaven, but bringing God out of heaven and down into humanity. That's what Jesus came to do. And then he said, all that's in me is in the Father, and all that's in the Father is in Jesus, all that's in Jesus is in us. John 17 is radical. It's like really head-hurting. People say, if only I'd met Jesus. And Jesus says, no, it's okay. I'm going back to the Father. I'm leaving you guys. You. That's his plan. We're his plan. So it's brilliant because we're image bearers and he's in us and he's given us a spirit, but it's also quite scary. But we are the plan to change culture. And then you look at the number of people going to church. I used this analogy the other week. There are 942 people go to the Irish League soccer game. Look at how much coverage it gets in the back of the papers and in the news and how many BBC correspondents are sent to these games. You listen to radio any Saturday. There are 942 people go to some of the churches in Northern Ireland every Sunday. There are 200,000 go every Sunday to church. That's just the Protestant churches, and probably the same in the Catholic churches, without getting but 942. So I think it's a total in the whole season. 190,000 people go to an Irish League game. Whole season, we've that every Sunday. Like, think of the difference that should make. 2,000 churches, fully paid up members. There's 2,000 people that are members of the DUP. 1,250 are members of the Alliance Party. 200,000. Most of those are paid up members of the churches. We should be absolutely knocking it out of the park. We're doing okay, but we could do a lot better. I might finish with that line because I'm not sure what the times are, so I think I'm probably done.
Thanks very much, Peter. Do you want to say something quick about your sign-up sheets and things you have at the back?
Relentlessly plug. We send out a weekly email. I do a little video blog, and there's some other stuff. If you sign up to that, that's all we'll send you, nothing else. There's some leaflets on marriage, on relationships, and I think pornography at the back, and a little card that says some videos that we've done. So a lot of this talk is in little 5-minute videos that might be helpful for youth groups or for other people to look at. They're on the cards at the back. But please do sign up if you want. And sorry if I went over slightly.